This is the new BMW X3, or at least that's what my neighbour thought when he saw it parked out front of my house earlier this week. This is in fact the new third generation X1, which is BMW's larger and bolder take of a small SUV. It's larger and bolder enough to prompt some, like my neighbour, to wonder why you'd actually want to stump up for a mid-size X3. That's a fair question, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Chasing cars. Honest reviews of your next car.
Brought to you by
Budget Direct.
This new U11 generation is more expensive than the F48 one that it replaces, though it is much larger and comes with a lot more standard equipment. We've reviewed the entry xDrive20i before, but this is the top spec xDrive20i, which clocks in at 65,900 or 12 grand more. However, those who are curious about the mid-size X3, if you want petrol and all-wheel drive, it's going to set you back north of $90,000. But there is a little bit more to this particular example. It is the M Sport, which is a little bit more expensive, and it has an enhancement package which also trumps up the price. So by the time you add 20-inch wheels, adaptive sports suspension, leather Venasca trim, the panoramic glass roof, and more, you've added $11,800 to the bottom line. So on road, this particular example sales north of $80,000. And the new X1 is pretty much larger in every dimension compared to the old one. This U11 is 53mm longer and 24mm wider than the old SUV. It's also 44mm taller and has 24mm of added wheelbase. At 4.5 meters in length, this new X1 is almost the same length as the original mid-size X3 of around 20 years ago. It's yet another so-called small SUV that's medium in girth, or what we're increasingly calling smedium. It sits on the same architecture as the old F48 X1, which debuted front-wheel drive for BMW's SUVs. But the larger newcomer has been redesigned inside and out. Its bluff and edgy look mightn't be quite as pretty as the old X1, but it is in line where BMW is heading with design. And it does look very upmarket, particularly with details such as the adaptive LED headlights. And in the overall, there's more than a little influence of the electric iX models in its overall styling. These 20-inch M Sport wheels are an inch larger than the standard fit 19s, which pumps up the proportions just nicely. So it's pretty impressive on the outside, so let's check out the interior. The X1 has received quite the interior makeover and a rethink of its user interface. And again, the influence of the electric iX is really apparent. BMW has followed Audi and Mercedes-Benz along the path of this big dual digital display unit. And the BMW brings a curved display that curiously has a 10.7-inch multimedia touchscreen as well as a 10.25-inch driver's screen. Why the different size screens? Well, it's presumably so you can see the whole of the driver's screen through the steering wheel. The operating system 8, as BMW calls it, and the design skins are slick and colourful if you're into that kind of thing. And BMW has ditched the time-honoured iDrive physical controller for more of a touchscreen interface. Some of the design nods to BMW's electric models include this floating centre console, the little stubby transmission controller, and the look of its new steering wheel. The look and feel is that of a modern grown-up BMW, and some owners and buyers are going to really like the fanciness. The cabin looks and feels like a modern grown-up BMW, and no doubt some of the fancy execution will delight some owners. But for some tastes like mine, it is a bit of a mixed bag. Let's start with a driver's screen that annoyingly and confusingly is oriented off-centre, slightly left of the steering wheel. Its content is fancy and better than some BMWs of recent times, though it still looks like a bit of a mess. Accessing some of the vehicle adjustments through the touchscreen is quite clumsy. For instance, stop-start takes digging through 4 submenus. The tiling system in the multimedia is quite handy, however the glossy screen does become a mess of smudged fingerprints. And while you do get this fairly large storage area under the floating console, actually getting access to it is really quite awkward. So the X1 is really nice if you don't touch anything. Case in point is the steering wheel, which is really chunky, and I've got big hands. In truth, the new X1 doesn't really deviate from traditional BMW isms, and that's not a bad thing because there are a lot of people who love what Munich does with its cabins. Dual zone climate control, a head-up display, excellent wireless Apple and Android smartphone mirroring, and a slanted inductive charge pad just because are all neat upmarket touches. Then there are BMW's somewhat controversial features on demand, or features that you can subscribe to. On the base xDrive20i, you have to pay an extra around $600 for seat heating that's actually installed from the factory. But that's not a problem here because that comes standard in this flagship. The M Sport seats are plenty supportive if you're into this style of seating, although it can get pretty uncomfortable on the thigh if you're climbing in and out all the time. Another downmark is, although they're electric with memory settings, there is no electric lumbar support. But it does feel roomy and airy up front, and if you are after that X3 experience, you actually might find it here in the smaller X1. So let's check out the second row. Where the X1 has really lifted its game and feels genuinely medium in size is in rear accommodation. The space here is huge, especially for knee room. The rear seat also gets slide and tilt adjustment, though you do have to stump up extra for the enhancement pack to get that. That said, the rear seat is very comfy and supportive. You also get dual rear air vents, dual USB-C ports to mirror those up the front, and 2 cup holders in the armrest. Boot size is a huge 540 litres, which is comparable to that of the mid-size X3. And when you stow the 40-20-40 split fold rear seat, it liberates 1600 litres. There's also a handy storage area under the floor, although there is no spare tyre. Next up is ownership, and hallelujah, BMW is finally offering 5 years of unlimited kilometre warranty after an eternity of the rubbish 3-year terms. In terms of servicing, BMW's pricing is actually pretty decent for its upfront servicing packages. Insurance, in the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer spent $1,135 to comprehensively insure a new BMW X1. Everybody's situation varies, and your premium will vary based on things insurers take into account, like where you live, how you drive, and where you garage your car. The high-spec xDrive20i fits a 2-litre turbocharged petrol engine outputting 150 kilowatts and 300 newton meters, and that's measurably more torquey than most average mainstream small SUVs. It also fits all-wheel drive on demand. At 7.4 seconds for the sprint to 100 kilometers an hour, it's no slouch. Although it's not nearly as swift as the xDrive25i of the last generation, which offered 20 more kilowatts and 50 more newton meters. Importantly for some buyer taste, the old 8-speed torque converter auto has been replaced by a 7-speed dual clutch gearbox. We recently drove the 1.5 litre 3-cylinder 18i version of this new X1, and we found it to be a fundamentally better drive than the previous generation. And I must say, the same rings true for this xDrive20i version. The steering is crisp and direct, if a little on the light side. And it's underpinned by a chassis that is quite engaging to punt around. And it's matched to a driveline that's actually pretty enthusiastic and lusty once you're on the boil. In truth, the engine doesn't really muster up a character that you would expect to match the M Sport looks, even if the shove that it ultimately musters up is actually quite decent. On the plus side, it's really quiet and polite, which is really going to please a lot of SUV buyers. The downside is it's really not the proper driver's machine that its vibe is trying to suggest. The M Sport version gets paddle shifters, and the left paddle has a novel sport boost function. Hold it down for 1 second and it kicks the powertrain and the chassis into sport mode. So let's see what it does. Well, it brings the noise at least. Outside of the sport boost mode, response is fine but unremarkable. And off the mark, that stop-start system can create a pregnant pause, which gets a little bit concerning when, say, you're trying to exit from a side street into traffic. The fuel economy claim is 7.2 litres combined, and it needs 95 RON in its 45 litre tank. On test, we've seen consumption as low as around the 5 litre mark on the highway, and it gets as high as around 8 litres in stop-start traffic. And on average, that's measurably thirstier than the little 1.5 litre 3-pot, which is 6.5. The trade though is that the 2 litre turbo is around a second and a half quicker to 100 kilometers an hour. The shifts of the 7-speed are impressively clean, and it's definitely a more refined dual clutch than some of the other designs out there. The all-wheel drive's rear axle is on demand, although this engine really can't muster up enough torque for the all-wheel drive system to augment some real dynamic talent. Typical for BMW, the suspension is set quite firm, and regardless of how you have the adaptive dampers set. And if anything, the ride could probably be a little comfier. Pretty settled on the move though. At low speed, some road acne can really sharply jolt up through the chassis. There's also a fair bit of suspension and tyre noise, and a little bit of knocking from the front axle. The i20 version gets driving assistance professional, so you get stuff like lane control assistance and a huge gamut of active safety and convenience features. So it loads in AEB with cyclist and pedestrian detection, blind spot monitoring, and rear cross traffic alert, as well as active lane keeping. The 20i version also loads in adaptive cruise control, a 360-degree camera system, and parking assistance. And that last feature, which BMW calls reversing assistance, basically tracks your forward movement for 50 meters and then can automatically retrace the course in reverse. When we reviewed the base xDrive20i, we said it was all the X1 you could ever need, provided you stumped extra for the enhancement pack. And now, having reviewed the xDrive20i M Sport, which is a whopping 11 grand more expensive before you add in 9 grand's worth of extras, we can double down on that original claim. But whichever one you choose, the new X1 is a fine SUV and a big improvement over the old generation. But it's really X1's core goodness that impresses the most, and spending more up the tree doesn't really return the kind of dividends that we'd hoped. That said, the new high-spec X1 feels like a proper BMW, and dare we say, a medium-sized one at that. So it's perhaps worth it not to sleep on the X1 if you think you actually want a larger X3. So that's what I think, but how about you? Put your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe while you're at it, and as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.